Hello, good morning, good evening to those of you in India. Good morning to you in the US or elsewhere in the world. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dhruva Jayashankar. I'm director of the US initiative at the Observer Research Foundation, ORF. On behalf of ORF, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you to a discussion today on democracy in India foreign policy and opportunities for cooperation between the United States and India. And we have a really excellent panel here to discuss that today. And it's also a very timely moment to be discussing this topic. The US is in the midst of a presidential transition from a Trump administration to a Biden administration. One of the issues that President-elect Biden has discussed, most notably in his essay in Foreign Affairs earlier this year, was advancing the idea of a summit for democracy. While that was noted and detailed in to some degree, I think there have been questions about what exactly will that mean in practice and how much of a priority it will be for the incoming administration. At the same time, there's been a lot of interest generally in India on this matter. And so to discuss this, we have a group of people. I'll introduce them briefly. We have Constantino Xavier from CSEP, a think tank based in New Delhi. Dr. Xavier was previously at Carnegie, India, and did a PhD from Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington. Ambassador Derek Mitchell is the president of NDI, an organization based in Washington, D.C. He was previously in the Obama administration US ambassador to Burma, Myanmar, and previously served in a number of different policy-making capacities in Washington. Tanvi Madan is a senior fellow and director of the India Initiative at the Brookings Institution in Washington. She joins us today from New Delhi, however. And we have Niranjan Sahu, who is my colleague, senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, who leads the organization's work on governance and democracy. To kick things off, I thought I would ask each of the panelists an initial question. I hope we can have a discussion amongst us and then turn to all of you for questions and answers. So after about 30 minutes, please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A function on this app. I thought we'd start with Constantino. The conventional view is that India does not promote democracy overseas, while Indians are very proud of being the world's largest democracy. But as your research has shown, is that really the case? And what, if anything, has India done historically to contribute to democratic governance in its external relations, even if it has not always adopted the rhetoric?
Thank you, Dhruva, and thank you to the Observer Research Foundation for hosting this discussion. As you mentioned, it's timely. There will be a lot of talk about democracy, foreign policy, US-India relations, and let me share with you some of these aspects that I like to dismiss, myths, I shall call them, about India somehow not being at the forefront or not being even bothered at all about democracy in its external engagements. And in my 5 minutes, I'd like to make two sort of factual corrections to frequent popular myths we hear a lot. And I think that addresses some of the myths or misperceptions, not only in the West about India, but also within India, sometimes where people don't realize how important certain values have been for India's foreign policy engagements on a variety of fronts. So number one, really, I think there's this very popular idea that India somehow has been a free rider, never contributed much to the cause of furthering democracy worldwide. And, my assessment really is that India has done as much, if not really more, for the cause of democracy than the West, the United States, and Europe in many ways. And let me try to spell out a few examples of why I say this and why I make this rather sort of unorthodox statement. I think number one, India is really led by example, right? This is an exceptional democracy that has had the rule of law, separation of powers, free and fair elections over 70 years continuously, with one rare exception over 2 to 3 years in the 1970s. So in that sense, I think India, by only existing and by having shown that it's possible to grow, to develop with a democratic system, has attracted a lot of attention and has really led by example in the developing world and attracted a lot of attention to its model. So I think in many ways, we can be also provocative and say that the first universal franchise election in India, 1951 national elections, were held in a very revolutionary setting where every citizen of India had a free vote and an equal vote, including the most dispossessed, marginalized populations, the Dalits, for example, while that was not always the case, even in parts of Europe and certainly in the United States until the mid-60s. So that's number one. I think we have to remember that, simply by existing and by having maintained its model, India has led by example. Second aspect is capacity building. I think very few people are aware of how much India has done in its engagement with the developing world in training, equipping officials from a variety of backgrounds from Africa, South America, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, in the procedural aspects of democracy. I'm talking in particular of a program called the ITEC program, ITEC, since the 1960s, which has trained dozens of thousands of officials from other developing countries in all aspects of democratic governance: health, education, judiciary, separation of powers, free media, policing, administration. These have been very popular programs that India has been running, where it shares its own experience with other countries. Most importantly, also parliamentary and election procedures. India has now 2 dedicated institutions that are very active in training parliamentary and electoral officers from other countries, mostly from South Asia and Africa, which are countries that are experiencing difficult transitions, democratic transitions, that look up to India as a model to emulate certain electoral parliamentary procedures that they see as similar to their own sort of models. Third, the global agenda. Let's not forget how much India has done on anti-colonialism in the 50s and 60s, on condemning apartheid South Africa at the United Nations and at various international fora. The role India has played at the United Nations Human Rights Council, where it has played a leading role. The United Nations Democracy Fund in the 2000s, in fact, set up together with the United States as a major initiative, funding other democracies and developmental efforts. The Community of Democracies, which celebrates its 20th anniversary this year, which was established in Warsaw in 2000. So I'd say that even if India sometimes has not always spoken the same language of democracy than the US or Europe, it's generally been comfortable in speaking, in being part of these various initiatives, and often, begging to differ with the US on certain principles, like most recently, maybe in the 2000s, the responsibility to protect principle, which India took exception from. But overall, India has certainly taken a leading role in many of these initiatives. Finally, if that all is not convincing enough, let's look at the region. I think this is where India's interests, security interests, economic interests with its immediate neighborhood are the strongest. This is where you would expect India to pursue interests, to not pursue sort of a democracy, values-based foreign policy. But as you mentioned from the research I've done, I was surprised to find out that democracy has always figured in India's understanding that greater, more transparent, accountable regimes, democratic regimes, if you want in a simple form, are the ones that in the long term bring greater stability through inclusiveness, equitable growth, and in that sense, the greatest stability for the region. So whether it was India and the US cooperating in Nepal in the 1950s, something we forget often, but the India and the US worked together in their development cooperation in Nepal, not only to keep the Chinese out, but to keep Nepal as a more democratic state, which was seen as it being in the interest of both India and the US. Whether it was the Indian response to Sri Lanka and the conflict in the 1980s, where India was actively promoting a more just polity for the minorities. Whether it was more recently in 1988, the Indian response to the coup in Burma, where India came out very strongly condemning the military authoritarianism in Burma. Or in Nepal already in the 2000s, where India actively midwifed a neo-republican democratic regime, despite concerns and actually more conservative positions from the United States and the United Kingdom in Nepal. They were less optimistic about the possibility of democratic reform in Nepal. India on all these fronts always pushed in favor of democracy. Let me just end, Dhruva, on 2 points that sort of mitigate this. I think it shouldn't surprise us that India has pushed for democracy. In fact, if you look at all prime ministers of India, they've always made it very clear that democracy is not only an issue of principle or morality, it's a source of stability, of growth. Two, all prime ministers have always emphasized that democracy is a natural condition for all humanity and sooner or later will come in some form or the other to most societies. So a really Fukuyamesque, if you want, approach to democracy is an inevitable end that may take a long time, but it will get there. And finally, India may not choose democracy as its friends, but often it has better relations with its democratic friends. I think that's, the bottom line that also speaks a lot to the importance of greater India-US engagement on democracy in particular. So while the rise of China today, if I may end on this note towards the future, the rise of China and its authoritarian model is seen as something that activates in India a greater interest in promoting democratic governance in other societies. I think we shouldn't bank on democracy as an automatic glue between the United States, India, Australia, India, and Japan. There's a lot of work to be done because India has its own approach to democracy promotion, assistance, which is different from the Japanese, the American, the European, or the Australian one. And there's a lot of more work in terms of coordination and cooperation on various policies to push the cause of democracy forward.
Thanks, Tino. I mean, there are a lot of questions also about translating some of that into practice and sometimes the very necessary trade-offs between interests and values that India has to make, just as a lot of other countries have to make. So hopefully we can get into that in the discussion. But Ambassador Mitchell, over to you. What is the thinking among the incoming Biden administration? What do you think as the president of NDI is the thinking around this idea of a summit of democracy that's been proposed by President-elect Biden? And what do you think it seeks to accomplish? And where can India play a useful role in your view?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Dhruva. It's great to see you, though on the screen. Last time we saw each other was in sunny lands and beautiful weather and pre-pandemic conditions in California. It's this is the way of the world right now. But great to see you. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I do want to say thank you to ORF, with which I've had a relationship for at least 15 years when I was at CSIS back in the 2000s. The last time I was out there, it was the summer of 2018, and I was talking about Taiwan-India relations under the new southbound policy through CSIS, which was a great opportunity. And in the old days, I used to work on bridging strategic Asia. I organized bilateral US-India conversations about East Asia, which I think I was one of the first to do that. And now we talk about Indo-Pacific, so I kind of consider that a bit of a success. But anyway, I always jump at the chance when invited by ORF to do anything, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity. On the issue of the summit specifically, and the Biden administration, I think their announcement of a summit, which, as you suggest, was introduced really in their foreign affairs piece, Biden's foreign affairs piece, early this year, I think it was, or late last year. And I commend folks to read that to see a couple paragraphs on how they're thinking about organizing one. But it was really based on a recognition of a few factors, in my view, from this administration. It's sort of it gets to the heart of their foreign policy vision. One, I think, is a recognition, or at least a strong belief, that liberal democratic values, accountability, transparency, inclusivity, representative governance under law, etc., that those values have underwritten peace, stability, security, and development of the international society for decades. Just a basic belief that these democratic values are essential, I think is at the root of, first of all, the summit. Secondly, that the foundation of US power and influence has traditionally been rooted in not just economic and military strength, but in commitment and adherence to those liberal values. It has been the basis of our soft power. And I never liked the term soft power because of the term soft. It sounds like it's soft, but it's real power. Our influence in the world has been based on a commitment to these values. And it's exemplified in that quote that people hear Biden say, that our strength comes not in the example of our power, but the power of our example. Sort of what Constantino was talking about in the India context the example of democratic activity in our liberal ways is a source of power. And that power is a recognition that power is atrophied in recent years under the Trump administration. We need to regain that. We need to regain the initiative. We need to take assertive action in that regard. And frankly, leadership, there's a sense of U.S. leadership in this. I think the summit, again, is an event to try to be assertive in regaining that initiative. Third, underlying all this, which I'm sure everybody here is aware of, is a recognition that there is an emerging normative competition being waged internationally by authoritarian powers, foremost of them being China. And that this is relatively new. I mean, it's not that China hasn't been doing this for some time quietly, but a recognition that this is a serious challenge and competitive normative challenge in the international system that we haven't seen in decades. It's manifested in the information sphere, in the cyber sphere, within international institutions, through aid and investment policies. These norms, these values, these standards of the international system are in play for the first time in decades. And I think it's really the defining challenge of this moment in history. We talk about climate change, we talk about all these important issues, pandemic, health issues. But at the heart of this is governance standards. And our world is being shaped in ways that are not necessarily, certainly in our interest, in the U.S. interest. And I would say to those who care about these standards that have underwritten the international system for decades. And we have to wake up to it and address the challenge assertively. And the summit is a very important symbolic and substantive statement in that regard. Next, fourth, is a recognition that we can't do this alone, that we need to have allies and partners. This is true throughout, I think, the Biden foreign policy agenda. We need to get back to allies, get back to partners, find common interests in working together. And it also means we have to work with not just governments, but civil society, the private sector, which will also be involved in the summit to meet the challenge effectively. So as suggested, a coordinated effort is always stronger. I think this is where we can do much better to be coordinated. To turn the tide is always power in numbers. I think that the summit is also a moment for that, a recognition of that. And then finally, there's a recognition that it's not just about what we do externally, it's also what we need to do at home. That we have to strengthen our own democracies, that no democracy is perfect. Constantino talked about the Indian example. We can talk about the American example. I think both examples are taking a hit lately, to be very, very honest about it. And I think we'll both, come to the table, or the U.S. certainly would come to the table, thinking about how do we strengthen our own institutions. In the foreign affairs piece, there is talk about not just working abroad, but working at home, demonstrating humility in this regard. But it's humility, I should say, that is without apology. It's a humility that doesn't say that we lack confidence in the rightness of democracy or democratic practice. It's just a humility that says that this is always a work in progress, and we need to continue to work on it, but we will be affirmative in the importance of these values, and the summit will represent that. So you can read, I think the summit itself, the parameters are a work in progress. There's not clarity on who will be invited, how it's going to exactly be organized, or where it's organized. Those things, from my sense, those blanks need to be filled. The foreign affairs piece talks about modeling it on the nuclear security summit. That suggests that countries that are part of this will have to come to the table with commitments, both at home and abroad, of kind of a price of entry. It does talk about fighting corruption. It talks about defending against authoritarianism, advancing human rights at home and abroad. It talks about including civil society, and it includes a call to action for the private sector, and it singles out technology companies and social media giants so that their tools and their platforms don't empower the surveillance state, don't gut privacy, facilitate repression, whether it's in China or elsewhere, spread hate and misinformation, etc. So there are some of these themes that run through it. But overall, it's really just simply to strongly affirm that democracy and democratic values are back as a centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy, and they must be for the so-called free world, as essential to international peace, stability, security, and development, and to demonstrate that history is on our side. Finally, on the issue of India, I'm sorry to go on for too long, but I have to say personally that it's essential for me, in my perspective, that India be at the summit table. It's hard for me to fathom holding this without the world's largest democracy. It could be controversial among some, again, because of the liberal trends that are being seen and reported on in India, and it could be controversial for the United States to host something like this for the same reason, because of the illiberal trends that people are seeing. But for this to, I think, even if no democracy is perfect, we do need to think, each of us, of how we are seen to be moving in the right direction. That's the most important thing, that we are seen to be moving, that we are firmly committed to moving in more liberalized directions and protecting our democracies. So there would have to be, I think, some commitments both in the U.S. and Indian side going forward on this. But I do, just bottom line on this is I do believe that the Biden team has a strong commitment to U.S.-India relationship. That has been a bipartisan commitment for at least 20 years. It will be reflected personally in the vice president's office and our new vice president. And I do think that India should be discussing this and bringing to the table, to the new administration, its ideas about what kind of summit would be most productive. Again, with these kind of outlines that I laid out being at the center of it, because I think the bigger and stronger the outcome, the better it will be for our mutual interests, and it will help on a wide variety of fronts, including in the coming strategic competition with China in particular. So with that, I just sort of end those remarks and turn it back over to Ruben.
Thank you. Thanks. No, that was a nice overview of what we may see over the next year, and so what the kind of broad agenda does look like. If I can turn over to Tanvi, what do you see as areas of potential cooperation between India and the U.S. in the years ahead? I think it's a nice segue from what Ambassador Mitchell just said. How will democracy feature in the bilateral agenda between India and the US, and where does it play a role?
Thanks, Trevor, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm going to kind of address kind of two things. I think there are two aspects to how democracy is on the agenda. I think one is as the two countries being democracies themselves and how it's facilitated their cooperation. And I think the second area is where they've cooperated in the past and what the potential kind of areas of cooperation might be in the future. I think if you think about the first aspect, the India-US relationship has essentially been built on at least 5 pillars. One is strategic, if you think about defense and security ties. Second is economic, trade, investment, energy, immigration, technology. The third is what you could think about as global order issues, whether that's big issues like climate change, public health, global public health, all kind of cooperating in international and regional institutions. A fourth pillar is people-to-people ties, including the diaspora, the cultural connections. And I think the fifth pillar, and it's crucial, has been democracy as a pillar in its own right. I think this breadth has created a multiple and a diverse set of constituencies for the relationship in both countries, across sectors, in different parts of the countries. It's also, as Ambassador Mitchell mentioned, created bipartisan support for the relationship. And it's made this relationship more sustainable and resilient to have kind of a broad-based set of sectors that support this relationship growing. In terms of the democracy pillar itself, I think we've heard some reasons why in and of itself, democracy has been kind of at least a glue. As Tino said, it's not the only one that has mattered, but it has been a glue in the relationship itself. And I think that's one aspect, which is as two democracies, this has been attractive to each other as partners. I think second is as democratic role models. And then third is the US and India as two countries who have engaged, sometimes very closely, with non-democracies, but who believe at the end of the day, and I think this is something Tino mentioned, that democracy is a worthwhile system, not just for themselves, but for other countries as well, and potentially kind of the right end states, though they have had different approaches towards kind of democratization or democracy promotion. I think other than kind of these direct aspects, you've seen democracy in some ways the two countries' democratic nature has also bolstered those other pillars that I talked about. In that sense, democracy has been a force multiplier in the relationship. So on the strategic side, India has essentially been seen and has portrayed itself as the un-China, not just, and the US has seen it, and multiple administrations have argued for a stronger relationship with India on the basis of the fact that it's not just a geopolitical counterbalance, but also a democratic contrast to that other big Asian country next door, a living example that democracy and development are not mutually exclusive. And a democratic India, in that strategic sense, has been one that multiple administrations in Washington have argued is worth making exceptions for, the nuclear deal, of course, being the prime example, but also that it is actively in American interest to support the rise of this democratic power in Asia. I think in terms of economic relations, you can quibble about kind of the level of support for liberal economic policies in both countries, and the difficulties they've had in terms of their own economic ties. But the fact that both are relatively open societies, the prevalence of rule of law, has facilitated across the range, economic exchange and engagement. I think in the global order pillar, the fact that India is as not just a large power that should have a right to kind of be at that high table, but as a democratic power, and that strengthened arguments for both India seeking a larger role for itself, but also for American policymakers arguing that India deserves and should have that larger role on the stage. And then, the final pillar, other than democracy, people-to-people ties. The reason that there is so much engagement that is not the kind of engagement India has with, say, a Russia or China, is that as open societies, there's been far more engagement, and open societies with free presses this has facilitated immigration, cultural ties, civil society engagements, educational ties, in a way that's just not the case in India's relationship with other big major powers that are non-democratic. Now, you can argue that the democratic nature of both countries, with the sausage making or samosa making, if you will, out in the public, has also made it tougher sometimes for the two countries to cooperate in these various realms. But once you work through the differences, once the countries have worked through these differences, the outcomes that they've resulted in have tended to be more sustainable over time. And I think these outcomes have also, in this cooperation, as kind of has been discussed, has included kind of democratization and democracy promotion as well, but just in different ways. Just briefly, kind of in terms of past cooperation between the two countries, and this has not always been kind of friction-free, but I think there have been a couple of different elements. One is, I think it's a factor that's forgotten. But the key U.S. contribution to democratic India's nation building and in the building of India as a democracy, I think, is often forgotten. That at a crucial point of a young kind of independent India, the U.S. poured billions of dollars in economic aid to democratic India to ensure that it succeeded, or at least didn't fail, as Soviet-backed communist China succeeded. This was at a time when Indian leaders themselves were concerned that if they didn't deliver the goods, as Nehru used to put it, while communist China next door did, that would undermine democracy in the eyes of Indians at a crucial stage of its evolution in India, and that they would actually say, why not have, like many other countries that were one by one going to military dictatorships or kind of authoritarian regimes, why not try that if it's delivering the goods? I think there's been that aspect of kind of US-India cooperation, which is cooperation that strengthened India itself. I think the second aspect has been the US and India supporting civil society and democracies, electoral systems, legal and technical assistance training, capacity building, as Tino put it, that has involved not just the two governments, but Indian and US civil societies as well. Sometimes in a coordinated fashion, in a cooperative fashion, but sometimes working in parallel with other kind of like-minded partners as well. So where do we kind of go in the future? And I'll kind of just take a minute or two to address this. I think the two countries can work together as democracies to ensure you could put them in two broad baskets. One is, I think, democratic resilience in the region in particular, But I'm thinking about it in the broader kind of Indo-Pacific, if you think about it in the kind of larger sense. And I think the second thing is they can work together as democracies to ensure the resilience of the international order. In terms of democratic resilience of kind of countries, I think, to ensure that existing democracies aren't weakened, that their systems are protected. So to help strengthen capacity building efforts, etc., strengthen the ability of countries to assess and resist or counter external coercion, interference, to provide alternatives to countries that say are looking to a country that only have China as a choice. The need to provide alternatives, including helping them develop, say, better contracts through technical assistance to ensure certain standards as they engage and certain kind of standards are met, even in the broader relationships with other countries. Now, the US and India can do this. I mean, I think this core area we'll be thinking about is Southeast Asia. But I think there's also kind of, and Tino has written about this, prospects in Africa as well. Now, the two countries have different comparative advantages. They have different resonance in these countries. They also come with different historical baggage. And so it might be easier for one to work in one place versus the other. I think this is somewhere the two sides will have to ensure that the governments and civil societies don't work at cross purposes. And then finally, I think it's important, and this is linked to the resilience of the international order piece of it, which I think it's important for the US and India to show solidarity for fellow democracies in the region when they are being faced with these pressures. And there's different ways of doing that. Just briefly on the resilience of the international order, I think to ensure that the countries are have a good defense in place, but also to be willing to go on offense. So, ensuring rules, norms, laws are followed, blunting attempts to weaken standards, misuse institutions for countries' own purposes, but also have a positive agenda. Follow that. It's important for the US and India to actually follow the very standards that they are propounding to the world, to ensure that this is a system, an international system, and an order that reflects realities. So it needs to be updated, and to also kind of be more forward-leaning in proposing better, more transparent standards. I think one area where you're going to see this democratic cooperation is as we kind of move into this era of flexible multilateralism, of kind of this era of coalitions where you're bringing together like-minded countries. I think you'll see this kind of cooperation possible in plurilaterals. We've seen some of this with the Quad. But we're also some of the proposals for D10s or T12s. These all involve democratic partners. I think the other place is international institutions where the US and India can cooperate. We've seen some instances of this at the UN, at WIPO, the Intellectual Property Organization group, at the WHO. And in the next few years, with India as a WHO Executive Board chair for the next few months, as a UNSC member for the next 2 years, and as G20 chair in 2023, there's going to be more scope for this kind of cooperation. The US and India will have to find ways, of course, of bringing in non-democracies that are nonetheless like-minded, but also kind of finally to work with competitors as well, non-democratic competitors, without undermining their fellow democracies' interests. I think Niranjan's going to cover a range of challenges. I'll just stop with one final line that I think the challenges that I see to US-India cooperation are the two countries needing to build their own democratic resilience. Their own democracies need constant tending. I think, also to mind their own behavior vis-a-vis smaller countries, reconciling their two different approaches. And then finally, I think what was already mentioned, which is tackling the trade-offs between values and interests that the two countries will run up against as they get into the strategic competition with China.
Thank you, Tanvi. And I mean, that's a sort of a rich, broad agenda sort of situated in the broader bilateral relationship. Thanks for that. It's also a good sort of transition to Niranjan. We can talk about democratic cooperation in abstract, lofty terms, but there are obviously a number of challenges. What do you see as some of the major obstacles to cooperation between India and the US on democracy, whether it's in bilateral relations or on global issues?
Yeah, thanks, Dhruva. for initiating this timely webinar. And I think my three co-panelists have covered wide ground. I think few things, especially on the domestic challenges that I would largely focus. But before I actually jump into that, I would just have at least one remark about what's actually happening, globally about democracy promotion, which always had a kind of, sort of different baggage in the global South. Today probably has acquired a different meaning altogether, especially with United States and some of the Western democracy taking kind of heavy backsliding over last a few years. So in a sense, democracy word itself is actually probably I think going through a kind of a crisis, identity crisis, I would say. I mean, something like third wave democracy and all that we saw in the 90s till early 2000 is today in a different sort of stage altogether. And this is where I think one has to look at India's own journey, which Tino elaborated. Of course, I don't have to repeat. In the mid 90s and early 2000, India in fact became one of the biggest backer after US and Europe, Western Europe. India probably invested a lot. Actually, it doesn't have an official policy about democracy promotion or the thing. But if you look at kind of a contribution in terms of technical capacity building support from the Election Commission of India and then Foreign Ministry, conducting elections in range of countries even in far off Africa. So India pioneered a lot of things, and in fact it also set up with United States UN Democracy Fund, the Community of Democracy, and incidentally in 1999 India hosted the World Democracy Forum, something which the right-wing government, in fact, under Mr. Bajpayee actually hosted it. So in a sense, India covered a lot of ground in terms of democracy promotion without an official policy. And today we are probably witnessing a different, situation. I think it's a basically changed time, I would say. Number one, I think the biggest problem from India's side is going to be largely because of the transformation of the state structure. I think it's ideological transformation of India, which is actually going to be the biggest stumbling block in terms whatever democratic cooperation India and US can think of with Biden administration taking sort of initiative of calling it Democracy Summit and many other lofty things which have been planned and which will ultimately happen. But I think one has to reckon the ideological transformation of India in terms of the nature of the state, the way, you are looking at, especially since 2014. Of course, 2014 is a kind of, I would say, it's a kind of turning point, but it has the entire ideological transformation has started long back, especially the right-wing turn of the state and the way nationalism is being used and nature of even number of institutions are also changing in this country, largely because you have also a state which no longer, I would say, if you look at evidence, looks at pluralism or diversity in a manner that it used to look at. So in a sense, if you look at India's transformation in last few years, including the way the nature and the status of a particular only single state, Muslim majority state, that is Jammu and Kashmir, was changed through Article 370. It is a kind of sort of telling kind of a that the state is becoming very different. And then other issues like Article that 370, which was removed, and then the way actually that state was split into union territory. And the second thing is about the minority rights issue, which especially with the triple talaq, that uniform civil code in which Muslim personal law, which earlier allowed sort of non-interference or any kind of way from the state, has changed now. So this is also one sort of signal. And the third signal also we witnessed through the Citizens Amendment Act, in which the citizenship was also linked with religion. In a sense, this is also something unprecedented, and this directly also in some way or other challenges the secular nature of the state. So in a sense, if you look at this actually in many ways would go against democratic ethos or liberal values. I'll note down at least some of them. One, you look at actually, in a sense, any kind of protest, any kind of dissent over these sort of actions have been taken with very, very kind of offensively by the state. And in a sense, if you look at number of people who have been detained or arrested, or kind of curbs or even sedition law used against many of those who actually directly challenged or wrote or in many way took to the court. So in a sense, this is one is a kind of a signal, and this is going to be a biggest challenge in terms of whatever democratic cooperation. The second, I think, and the far bigger development is the hegemonic rise of Bharatiya Janata Party, the ruling party, which has become a hegemonic party. It's no longer actually, in fact, I would say as a democratic scholar from last 25 years, if you see democracy, federalism and human rights, many things, even civil society upsurge in this country happened largely under successive coalition governments. If you look at 1989, onward, and that largely happened because the state was not, that powerful, and it was not ruled by a single party to put a curve. And wherever in whichever situation in India, we have a single party which is has a hegemonic presence. Earlier the Congress had, and Congress also did almost similar thing, including the imposition of emergency. So the single and the hegemonic parties are always in India, especially in India, against kind of that liberal ethos or dissent or sort of a civil society kind of freedom that they demand that everything has to be done through consultation and many such methods that democracy generally demands. So in a sense, we are looking at also that's second thing which is actually has a bearing, and that's where actually if you look at even any international criticism on any policies of the government which has certain international ramification is taken very hypersensitively. So in a sense, the government is very, very sensitive in that sense. In fact, what one saw actually Article 370 criticism, some kind of indirect criticism by Kamala Harris. In fact, actually generated a lot of actually criticism and kind of backlash from India, especially from the right-wing ecosystem and the party that is in power. So I'm saying these are some of the bottom line on which actually one has to see how India and US can actually cooperate on democracy promotion and building many things. And the third important thing which Dhruva had said yesterday is about India's also profile in the region is also rapidly changing. If you look at what mentioned, the power of example, other things, I think over last couple of years, if you look at certain actions and some of the developments, including decline of the institutions, and then the way things have happened in terms of press freedom or freedom of speech and expression, on many count actually India's global and especially regional profile has changed rapidly in a sense. I don't think the world and especially the South Asia or even the Asia looks at India in a manner that they used to look at least 5-7 years back. So power of example, and India being one of the kind of I would say guiding light of this region in terms of democracy has suffered a lot. And this is where also US-India can actually, because US also has gone through the similar trajectory in last 4 years. And in a way, actually, what Tanvi said that both have to actually work to improve their own democratic credential domestically, and before they embark upon the global kind of thing, democracy promotion and many things earlier they used to do. So if you ask me, couple of just 1 minute, Dhruva. I think one area where actually there will be ample scope sort of cooperation between these two countries is largely related to China, especially because it's geopolitics and geoeconomics which will bring actually India, US closer, and in some form or other, democracy will be there in the menu, because it cannot be just ignored, because largely whether you talk about Quad and many other initiatives, I think democracy will be there in the menu. It largely because of China, because China's kind of presence in the South Asia, which is very well documenting in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, even Myanmar, which ambassador knows very well, the kind of interference, China's increasing role. In fact, in Nepal, the Chinese ambassador is almost like setting up the meeting between the opposition and the government, and the way that never used to be the case. China doing 5 years back. So in a sense, we are seeing a new China, a different China, and India cannot really on its own really checkmate China, because it involves several things, including investment and economic this thing, which many of these countries are benefiting from China. So in a sense, they have very strong interest to go with China, and values interest hardly matters. Not interest, the values part can be sacrificed. So I'm saying this is where I think the narrative may change, and probably India, US can find some room for cooperation. But I think over and above, if you see, I don't think in the 90s and early 2000s, the kind of cooperation happened between India and US in terms of democracy building and many initiatives. I don't think that has a chance, especially the way India's state transformation is happening, the ideological transformation and the rise of hegemonic party, and then the of course the global ecosystem in terms of democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Niranjan. No, I mean, I think we have to be realistic that there are, in some ways, it's almost as if because of the challenges, both external and internal, it is all the more reason, I think, to have a conversation like this on sort of areas for growth and opportunity. We have a few questions coming in from people, and what I'm going to do, just given the time, is actually group them together and sort of direct them at each of you one by one. So I'm going to start with Ambassador Mitchell. There's a question from Myanmar. You served as ambassador there in Yangon and Naypyidaw. You at a critical time for that country in its democratic evolution, had its first elections. It's just had another election. It's a neighboring country of India's. Did you, both from the point of view of seeing that as a test case for a nascent democracy with all its attendant problems, how do you see that progressing in the future? And what was your experience like in cooperating as a US government representative with your Indian counterparts in that effort?
Well, thank you for that question. Well, look, every democracy, as I said, is a work in progress. And, we had there was a moment of sort of euphoria, which I always felt was premature about developments in the country. Anybody who understands Myanmar and India understands Myanmar well, understands the complicated nature of the situation, the internal situation, in terms of its divisions, its diversity, its long-running civil war, as it were, internally. And democracy is just one of the challenges that they face, including economic underdevelopment, et cetera. So, I think it's progressing, a little slower than we would like. But I think it is still on track. There's still a strong commitment. We just saw that in the recent election. Very, very strong commitment, at least on the electoral side. People came out in large numbers under pandemic conditions to vote. So people want to ensure that they have representative governance. Civil society remains quite active. They're not as free as they need to be, nor is the media, but they're asserting their rights, and they're certainly better than it was 10 years ago. Not nearly what we would like it to be, or the people would like it to be, but it's moving in its own path. In terms of how I engaged, and particularly engaging with my Indian counterpart, look, Myanmar, when I worked on this with RRF, say 10, 12 years ago, and talked about it, and CSIS, it was an issue of the deepest division between us. And when I had dialogues about East Asia in those days, we would talk nicely about Japan. We should do more trilateral basis and more in Korea. What do we do with Vietnam, which is, all these things, all very positive, all very good. We talk about China. There was mutual concern about where's China headed. Much more clarity now of where China is headed. But back then we talked about it. We get to Myanmar, and there'd be almost, I use it metaphorically, but almost fist fights. We'd be yelling across the table, "Stop lecturing us about Myanmar! You got to engage." And I had good conversations. But, I think when I was there as ambassador, as things evolved on the ground, I was very close to my Indian counterpart. We had very good conversations. We had differing perspectives in the sense that, India's American diplomacy, certainly under Obama and when I was ambassador, was more forward-leaning. It was very much in the middle of things, trying to, to bring the sides together to shape the change. And India has a much, more of a laid-back attitude. Investment, economically focused certainly on your eastern border in Rakhine State and Chin State. But it was very complimentary, and I had very good conversations. But so it wasn't we weren't working against each other. We both had we always had the same goals. It's just I think the Indian side felt that pushing too hard, being the Americans as we always are, being a little bit, pushy on things. Indians are more hesitant of that kind of approach, but they saw that there was progress, and we worked very well together. And I think we can work, and it's an area we absolutely have common interest even today on bringing peace and stability on the border and reconciling the differences in that country. And the more that we can see that Myanmar continues on a democratic, open path, where we have good relations, the more that we can help them resist the pressure of China. If they feel isolated, they will turn to China. If they feel that they are open, the Rohingya issue is a big deal in this, obviously. And we don't have to go down that path. It's a big obstacle. But if we could find ways that we can both engage now, we've created a situation where we can both engage and not isolate, that will help, I think, both our interests. We need to be talking about this much more.
Thank you. Tino, you made a very persuasive case for how India has traditionally actually done quite a lot for global democracy through multiple media. But I think a skeptical view would be, I think two things. One, there is inevitably a sort of a clash of narrow interests, particularly in the near neighborhood, which is more sensitive, and at times India has seemed to look away or quietly support what might be considered undemocratic practices by leaders when it's deemed in its interests. At the same time, you also see, the criticism is India is not more vocal in criticizing a country, sort of global countries, countries like Russia and in West Asia, where India does have very deep interests as well. How do you sort of square that with what you said?
Yeah, Dhruva, I was just reminded when Ambassador Mitchell was speaking about Myanmar about two interesting reactions that I think are quite telling about India's approach to the neighborhood and differences with the US. And sometimes differences are healthy and you agree to disagree. You may even divide roles, play good cop, bad cop. And I think this idea that everyone has to pursue the same policy towards authoritarian countries can actually be self-defeating. But I was remembering late President of India at that point, External Affairs Minister Pranab Mukherjee, I think in a CNN interview in the early 2000s on Myanmar, and being cornered and saying, why is India not doing more? Why is the great democratic India not coming in support of the democratic movement or supporting sanctions at that point, 2003-4 onwards, actually, which were in vogue on Myanmar? And he said, at some point, it was a very frank statement. He sort of looked up and said, what can I do? I can't choose my neighbors. I wish I had a more democratic Myanmar, but I have to engage them as they are. And he was also referring, by the way, towards the Western Front and Pakistan. At that point, the US obviously had much cozier relations with a still military authoritarian Pakistan. Sort of India was also suggesting that, we have our interests. And if the US has interests in faraway Pakistan, obviously India will have very important core interests in its immediate neighborhood towards its east in Myanmar. The other statement, I'd like to recall on this is Ambassador Shishankar Menon, who works with us at CSEP. He had his interesting line on Myanmar, saying that, and former National Security Advisor, of course, saying that the appetite to impose sanctions is proportionate or positively proportionate to the geographic distance of the country imposing sanctions on the target country. So it's easy. I would add it's also proportionate to your capacity, to your power, right? And of course, the US has had much more power, much more capacity, has been geographically insulated and far away from many of these countries, and could take, I think, strong positions on these issues, which India unfortunately was not always able to do. And that greater dialogue, I think, between India and the US will lead naturally to greater understanding. So I don't think we'll see many more fistfights between Indian and American officials on these countries. In fact, there's greater understanding. But listen, Dhruva, we all have authoritarian skeletons in our democratic clauses. The US has them with South Africa. India has them with Myanmar in the 2000s. We all have illiberal challenges at home. I like what Ambassador Mitchell is saying about the humility, which is an important precondition for dialogue, and also an openness, shall I add, from the West towards learning from India, maybe. Maybe there's one or two things the US and Europe can learn from India on how to promote democracy in a more silent, constructive, sustainable way, rather than just pushing sanctions on other countries. One last point, Dhruva. I slightly differ from Ambassador Mitchell's sort of suggestion that we may have to hold up some bars or entry criteria into this democracy summit. I think these democracy summits will be seen with suspicion from many countries, including India, as just another geostrategic ploy to contain and isolate China, sort of as a cynic, strategic approach. I don't believe that, obviously. I think I've made my case clear, but this will be for many countries a suspicion. And if that was already suspicion in the 2000s, you can only imagine how for countries that are sort of illiberal democracies or in transition, there'll be a great suspicion about joining these summits. And I think, therefore, I would suggest an open doors policy where you really don't have bouncers at the entry saying, you're democracy, you're not democracy, what is your record, will you take commitments to improve your democracy? But a smarter way to do this, maybe, let me end with a suggestion, is focus on developmental topics that are core interest to all democracies. For example, one of my favorite examples, Dhruva, you've heard me many times about this, but on data governance and data privacy. If you have a democracy, summit of democracies, which has the main emphasis just on a discussion on how to ensure privacy, civic rights of citizens in democratic states, and how to balance the imperatives of security and economic growth and centralization and control of data, but also decentralization and civic human rights, if you want, for citizens of these countries, you will have many, many countries lining up to entering that democracy summit.
Thank you. No, actually, this is a good way of plugging. In fact, Ambassador Mitchell and I were, in January of this year, we're in the same place in California where we were at a group meeting that included people from the US, but also from across the Indo-Pacific. We had people from Australia, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, India as well, to discuss some basic, what are basic underlying principles for democracy in the Indo-Pacific. And, it was an exercise that was meant to be as inclusive as possible and adopt as wide-ranging an approach. You can find some of that if you look for Sunnyland's principles on the CSIS website. You can find actually the document that was produced from that, which I think, at least it's quite similar to what we were hearing. Sort of is an exercise in humility. I think everybody was understood, all the participants understood that this was not countries sort of lecturing each other on how to run their business, but actually sort of where are constructive ways of supporting democratic norms and principles going forward. I'll turn to Tanvi again. Yeah, please.
Just add really quickly on this point that I do think, though, and I'm not involved in organizing the summit, but I do think it's going to be about voluntary commitments. I don't think there's going to be you must do this, you must do that, but it's along the lines of what Dhruva said and what the Sunnyland principles were about, which are general principles that the countries will adhere to, and then coming to the table voluntarily. Again, as Danvi said, I said that democracy is a work in progress everywhere. No one is perfect. So coming, though, and affirming that, look, we are committed to do certain things in order to make ours stronger, in order to then go and say, but then we also want to bring standards globally. And so I think it's going to have that kind of humble component. And I do take the point on the anti-China. I think it's very important, as we all discuss this, that I think Danvi also said this, it needs to have a very positive agenda. This is a positive thing. The degree to which third countries believe that democracy support, the work of NDI, the work of India, the work of anyone, is directed against a country, or is geopolitical, or is part of a new Cold War, or is part of that kind of, great power competition, that's harmful because, as I say, these norms and values have been underwriting peace and stability and development globally. They're affirmatively good and important. And it's not about China, it's about the values that they're bringing. And it's not just China. There are other countries that are doing that as well. We could say Russia, you can say Iran, you can say Saudi or others, or Turkey. I mean, so these things are also important. Focusing on the norms and standards and values, but not on the countries, I think will be very important. We should always keep that in mind.
Thanks. My job is to be contrarian sometimes as a moderator, but I know this is not just about China. But turning to Tanvi, I was going to group together a bunch of questions related to that very subject. To what degree do you see, a lot of the renewed interest on the part? I mean, again, sometimes not always couched in democratic language, but we are seeing, the D10 groupings of artificial intelligence, India's objections to the Belt and Road Initiative. Even a question about trade and RCEP and India's skepticism about entering into a trade agreement with China. How much are these factors, on the idea of basically animating in some ways a renewed drive towards democratic cooperation that we're seeing again with the Quad, with D10 and with other things?
I think I look at this, as you can imagine, slightly differently, in the sense that I think India is a good example of you can give entire speeches, entire policies without mentioning the C word, and yet it's all about China. Now, I'm not saying this issue is all about China, but I think I'm not sure we would be necessarily having these conversations in a way if China wasn't only behaving the way it is vis-a-vis the international order, as well as the fact that Xi Jinping has dropped any pretense that China is not exporting, wants to export its model, its behavior after COVID, especially once it succeeded in controlling it, to actively undermine and point to democracies and see that's not working, we are, and then actively exporting the tools of suppressing. So I think we can't, and it has the power. And the influence today that is expanding that will affect countries' domestic politics, the landscapes all of us are working with, in a way that a Russia, Iran, and a Saudi Arabia just can't have to that extent. So I think it does shape the context. I think today, slight disagreement with Tina on this, I think today India's objections or concerns about a democracy summit would be less about not coming to the table because it would seem like everybody's getting together to talk about China. They might have concerns about Russia, but I think the China thing is less because if you think about it, a Quad ministerial in the middle of an India-China crisis, that is a mini democracy summit. If you look at the four readouts, there were four separate readouts that came out of that Quad meeting. But even though, other than the US statement, the C word wasn't mentioned. And, people didn't hammer on about democracy. I think the underlying thing, following the rules-based order, the norms, the international law, I think this is reflecting something that was a subject of debate a few years ago, that whatever China did at home wouldn't spill over externally. That it would be a law-abiding, rule-abiding country. And I think the hope is that collective action with other democratic partners could, because they also happen to be the countries who have power. It's not just that they're democracies, but if you look at Europe, if you look at Asia, and Asian allies and partners that the US has, and the US, they're not just democracies. They are large, powerful countries that can hopefully shape Chinese behavior. And it hasn't been coordinated. But I think there was some hope that China itself, as it grew, as it became, kind of more economically developed, and for its own interest, would stick to these rules that have helped it grow. And what countries are finding is that that's not necessarily the case. That maybe the way it behaves at home is shaping the way it behaves abroad. I will give you one example, maybe stop there, which is it was striking for me over these last few months, in particular, even before the boundary crisis, after former Indian policymakers, senior China hands, people like Vijay Gokhale, who was former foreign secretary and ambassador, India's traditional view is ideology didn't matter. It wasn't about ideological competition. It wasn't about China's ideology. When people, Indian policymakers who have been at the highest levels, are talking about the fact that China's lack of transparency initially is a direct result of it not being a democracy, and that has spilled over not just into the neighborhood, but into the entire world and affected our entire year, our economies, our health in a way that you cannot contain just into China. So I think, while this conversation might not be, and whether it's impact on technology, freedom of navigation, etc., I think we are now thinking it's not going to be a Cold War. I think we can talk about why that's a bad analogy, but I do think it is hard not to see over the last kind of few years, and particularly the last few months, that the nature of the Chinese government is starting to matter to its external behavior, and it's also making it very hard to understand for those of us on the outside what's going on. So I do think whether or not the C word is mentioned, that is very much going to be on the table. I'll just say one more thing, which is I think the Indian objections to or concerns about this will be more about these situations, whether you're trying to get more partners or build constituencies within partners. I think it's about addition, not subtraction. So what do you do about a partner like Vietnam? Is it at the table at a democracy summit or not? You want to bring it in. You don't want to exclude it. And so democracies shouldn't be shy about getting together. But the question is, how do you bring them in? I think the second thing, obviously, is the sovereignty hawk in India that doesn't want to see this as, is very quick, as Niranjan said, to talk about other countries interfering in it, or seeing these things as interference in internal affairs.
Thank you. Niranjan, there's one question that sort of flows from that in some ways, which is the US's cultural acceptance around the world has played a big part in the establishment of its global power. Do you think that China can exercise that kind of power globally, given its current model? So while we talk about the eroding soft power and trust of democratic institutions, whether it's American or Indian or other models, how much are alternatives really able to fill that space?
I think very tough question. In a sense, first, I think it's difficult to compare. I think the US model and then the Chinese model, the political system, I mean. One is a liberal democratic model and with proven kind of results, and we have seen how that particular model has powered prosperity, growth, and equity and unimaginable kind of development in many fronts over several I would say several decades. I mean more than a century. So in a sense, US, which is a lighthouse of democracy and liberal values and norm setting, other thing, with all its pitfalls, imperfection, what we are witnessing today in US, maybe probably kind of something which is not going to last forever. Probably it's a sort of a kind of a historical kind of phenomena, probably which will last probably a couple of decades and probably may ease. But I think if you look at the global survey by the Pew and many other even Rand survey, other thing, year after year, almost 70 to 80% of if you look at countries still aspire to have a kind of political system like United States. So in that sense, there is no dispute. And China, in fact, Chinese leader themselves also openly accept that the political system is not something worthy even exportation. They don't even think of exporting because they have really nothing to offer. And especially after the collapse of Soviet Union and many other tragedy you have seen with communist system, I don't think anybody is interested. I think people are largely interested in the authoritarian mode of turning the capitalistic system and how that growth economic model is something I think a lot of countries are importing in a sense. So I think on that count, I think it's a settled debate. there is no way China can match. And in terms of values, I don't think China really offers anything in terms of values or norms per se.
Thanks. We're running short of time, so I'll just have one question that I thought I would pose perhaps to Ambassador Mitchell. If he's still on, I'm actually getting a little disruption. Okay, which is, there's been one of the sort of principles at the Sunnylands conversation we had was the participation of youth. And one of the things that surveys have shown is that amongst younger voters in particularly the West, the US, Europe, even Australia, there is less enthusiasm for democracy, at least surveys, comparative surveys have shown this, whereas actually, and Japan too, by the way, whereas in South Korea, Indonesia, India, there's much more enthusiasm amongst the younger, this is shown in voter turnout and stuff like that. Is that one area that you think is a cause for concern in the future, and so what could be done to remedy that? I mean, where in the developing world, largely you have greater enthusiasm amongst younger populations for democracy, whereas compared to the developed world.
Yes, I mean, there's always room. We should never be complacent about anything. That's my biggest fear in life and work is complacency. So we should be concerned when we see those polls. But frankly, I'm not as concerned. I don't believe that truly. I mean, you look at the recent elections. Look at the recent engagement in the streets. Young people are mobilized. Young people are active. Young people are engaged. Young people are passionate. They're passionate about climate change. They're passionate about diversity and about inclusion. They're racial justice. And all of that is about democracy. I mean, so you have to break it down. Democracy seems, when you talk about it, it seems like an ism. It seems like an ideology. It's not. It's a very practical thing. I mean, I would ask people, do you want to have a free voice? Do you want to hold your government accountable? Do you want your government to be transparent to you? Do you want the ability to speak freely and have media that you have access to? Do you want, to engage openly and express yourselves? Yes, 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 yes. Then you believe in democracy. Do you want inclusion? Then you believe in democracy. Do you want representative? So there's just frustration in the United States and in many developed countries. And we're seeing to some degree in even developing countries that democracy hasn't delivered according to what their expectations are. There's a frustration that, in the aftermath of 2008, the financial crisis, that there's still injustice. That all these years, there's still racial injustice. That the Trump years have led to regression. That leaders are not listening to them. The answer is not to get frustrated by the youth, resentment, but is to listen to them, to empower them. There is a regression in democracy, but the one thing that's been going up in the past 20 years is political participation and it's led by young people around the world, and particularly women among young people. So you empower women, you empower young people, you bring new voices into the field, into the fold. You get the older men out of the way, the usual old think, have a new generation, and open the window, open the doors to fresh perspectives. That diversity and that fresh perspective, you'll get a revitalization of democracy, but still it has to deliver. And this is something we struggle with at NDI too, is you have the initial euphoria, then people realize it's not going to answer all your questions simply to have an election. You have the same old guys doing the same old things with new rules. They just game the rules. So you have to bring new folks into that mix, empower them, and then make sure that there's equitable results. And we talk about that in our Sunnyland principles, that economic development, equitable, inclusive development is an essential part of any democratic agenda. And young people are very attuned to this. So obviously we should be concerned when people are frustrated, but what it tells you is then we have to deal with the faults and the weaknesses of democracy, and it's not about democracy itself. We just need to strengthen the democracy rather than get rid of the democracy, because there's no alternative. You can run to populism and demagoguery, but we know where that leads. We've seen that in many of our countries. So that's how I'd answer that.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, but thank you all for a rich discussion. And on behalf of ORF and on behalf of the viewers, I think this was very well attended. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I tried to group them together as much as possible to tap the collective expertise on this panel. I left with many sort of new thoughts, both constructive but also I think realistic about what we can do, but look forward to more such conversations. I think this will actually pick up as a theme over the next year. So on that note, thank you all for your time. Good morning to you, good evening to all of you in India, and thank you all to all participants. Goodbye.